Hello, this is Amin, and you are watching session 39 of ASP.NET Core tutorial. The content of these tutorial series are compatible with ASP.NET 5 and ASP.NET 6. That's why if you want to develop your web application with ASP.NET 5 and ASP.NET 6, you can use the content of this tutorial. That's why you can follow our tutorial if you want to work with ASP.NET Core 5 and ASP.NET Core 6 as well. In this session, we continue the discussion about form validation, and also we introduce one more attribute, and also we will show you how you can create a custom attribute and how you can customize a existing attribute, and also we will show you how you can create one custom validation as well. The first part of this session is related to range attribute, and you can use range attribute on different properties, and you can set a range of acceptable value for each property. For example, for amount, which is decimal in the project that we develop in this tutorial series, you can set a value of decimal, and for example, it can accept the amount between 0 to 100,000, and also you can use range attribute for data as well, and also you can implement it for integer and for the rest of property. Let's go to Visual Studio and work with range attribute. Later on, we will talk about custom attribute and custom validation. This is the project that we have been working so far throughout this tutorial, and I want to add range attribute to one of my model or view model that I have in this project. I'm going to create cast view model, and this is the view model that I have implemented some attributes same as required and string length in previous session. If you haven't watched previous session, I highly recommend watching that session before going to this session and start this session. And as I mentioned, you can implement and you can add range attribute on different properties. The first property that I want to use range attribute for, that one is amount. You imagine that you want to enforce your customer and enforce your end user to enter a positive amount and positive value inside the amount, and you want to validate the form. If the entered value inside amount is negative, you can reject it, and you can inform the user the amount and the value that he or she entered in the amount field should be positive between a range. That's why I can use range attribute here. And just bear in mind, range same as required and a string length is inside a data annotation namespace. And as I have added this namespace in previous session, I can use range as well here. And inside the parentheses, you can enter the range that you accept for example, in this example inside the amount. And as you can see, it's received minimum amount and the maximum amount of range. And also you can use error message for customizing the error and the rest of the parameter that you can use. And I want to set this range between 0 to 100,000. And I want to add a range on the date field, and I want to enforce my user to enter the date between a specific range. That's why I can use range for a date property as well. But here I should use a type of date before entering the range date. That's why I use type of date and time. And in the next part, I enter the start range of the date. I use 1st of January 1996 to 1st of January 2050. And then I should close the parentheses, and as you can see, I use another overloaded version which receive type of the property and also the minimum range and the maximum range. Let's run the project and see whether these two validation is working well here or not. Project is up and running, and I go to cast create a strongly typed view, and here for amount I entered, for example, a negative amount, and also for date I use a date before 1st of January 1996, for example 20 of August of 1990, and then submit the data. You can see the form is relaunched, but I haven't received any validation error because I haven't used the proper HTML helper, which is validation message for these two property. That's why I should add the validation message for HTML helper for these two property to display the message, the proper message when I receive validation error. Let's back to Visual Studio and add the proper HTML helper. I should go to create a strongly typed view, and here for amount I use the HTML helper that I used in previous session for a comment field, and here with the lambda expression I bind it to amount, and also I use this HTML helper again for date. If you are not familiar with this HTML helper, I recommend you to watch session 38 before continuing this session to know more about validation message. And here with this lambda expression, I bind it to date property, and I can do formatting for the code that I enter by selecting the area of code that I want and then press Control K and Control F, and you can see all the code format would be corrected. Let's save the project and run the project once more. And again, I go to cast create a strongly typed view, and here I entered one negative amount, and here I use the date before 1996 and submit the form. And you can see I received the validation error here. Here it's mentioned the amount should be between 0 to 100,000, and here it's mentioned the value 20 of January 1990 is not valid date, and you know this message is not related to the range validation because based on my computer setting, its date format should be month, day, and again I submit the form, and you can see now I received the range validation message. The field date must be between 1st of January 1996 to 1st of January 2050. And also if I entered here the amount more than 100,000, for example 150,000, and here I entered a day after 2050, for example 2051, you can see I received the validation message again. But you imagine sometimes you want to do some changes on the attribute that I use for validation. For example, I have several property with a string which its maximum range should be, for example, 10 or 50, but I don't want to repeat this data for every string field. On that situation, I can customize a string length attribute and create one custom attribute for that one and use the string length attribute and customize it. And I can use that attribute for all the property that I want to receive maximum amount of, for example, 10 characters or 20 characters. Here is the instruction that I should use for create custom attribute. And first I should create a class, and that class should be inherited from the attribute that I want, for example, a string length attribute here. And then I should implement the method and overload the base method. And inside that base method, I can do some changes that I want. For example, here I can give the amount of 10 for the base method. And then I can use this customized attribute for the property that I want to have the maximum length of character of 10. Let's back to Visual Studio and create one custom attribute. You can create the custom attribute file everywhere in your project, but as long as I want to keep the format of my project more clear, I create the custom attribute file inside custom HTML helper folder, or you can even create a dedicated folder for this purpose. But here I use this folder that I have created for custom HTML helpers to store my custom attribute file. And here I create one class file, and I use one meaningful name for this class, allowed character length. And as I mentioned, it should be inherited from the attribute that I want. And here it is a string length attribute, but as its namespace is not available here, I can't use it before adding the namespace, and its namespace is inside the System.ComponentModel.DataAnnotation. And then I can implement the base class here, and I go to definition of this attribute. And you can see it has just one overloaded version which received the maximum length, and also a string length is inherited from a validation attribute. And if you look at validation attribute, you can see it has error message parameter and the rest of the parameter that I can use. And also a string length attribute, it has another parameter which is maximum and minimum length. Let's back to the allowed character length class file which I created. Let me implement the base class here by pressing Ctrl period and adding the base class here. And here I can implement the code that I want, or even I can use the base class, and here I can enter the maximum length of the character that I want. For example, I use 10 characters, and then I can allocate this custom attribute to the property that I want, and that property automatically receive maximum character of 10. And if I want to enter more than 10 character, it's stopped me. Let me use this attribute inside the view model that I have. And for example, here for comment, I comment the string length of 50, and I use this customized attribute instead of a string length, and I should add the namespace to use this attribute. But before launching the project, as you can see here, it expects to receive one integer amount. But as I want to fix it to 10 characters, I can remove this part as well. And here you can see I can use this custom attribute without any input parameter. And let's run the project and check whether this custom attribute is working or not. Project is up and running, and I go to create a strongly typed view, and here inside the comment I try to enter a character more than 10 and it stopped me. and you can see I can enter just 10 characters, and you can see my custom attribute is working fine. But another way that I can create one attribute for the validation form is creating a validation instead of customizing attribute. Let's see what I can do for that purpose. Here, if I want to create one attribute from the base, I can inherit my class from validation attribute instead of the specific attribute. And then I can use isValid method, which is a base method for validation attribute, and use the condition that I want. Let's go to Visual Studio and create another class for creating a custom validation. And here I want to implement this validation for the string field, and I want to accept the character between 5 to 10 characters. And if your user entered a string more than 10 characters or less than 5 characters, the ASP.NET Core invalid the form status, and it's return a message to the view again. Let's go to Visual Studio and implement this validation as well. And here inside the custom HTML wrapper, again, I create one class and I change its name to allowed character range, because I want to set a range of character for this attribute. And as I mentioned, this time it should be inherited from a validation attribute, and I should add its namespace again, which is data annotation again. And if you look at the definition of the validation attribute, you can see it has several versions of overloaded, and also it has several methods, and I want to work with isValid method for validating a property. That's why I use that property, and I overwrite isValid property to do the validation, and it should be public, and I should override it, and its results would be Boolean, and it is valid, and it received the value as an object, and I can convert the value to the type that I want, and then I set the validation and I set the condition that I want, and then return the result. The result should be a Boolean. Here I create a variable from a string, and I convert the object to a string by convert to a string, and I use the value. And here I can set my condition, and then I can return the Boolean result. For example, my condition is if str length is greater or equal 5, and str length should be smaller or equal 10. If the condition is true, return true, otherwise return false. But I can make this code shorter, because this expression return a true or false value, and that's why I can omit this condition here, and directly I return the result of this expression. If the string would be between 5 to 10, it returns true, otherwise it returns false. That's why I remove this part of code and I save it. And then inside my view model, I use this attribute that I created. And here I comment this part, and I use the new validation that I created. And also, as it's inherited from validation, you can see I can use error message and the rest of the parameter which I have inside the validation, but I keep it with the original message. Let me save it and run the project again to see whether this validation attribute is working fine or not. Let me refresh the page, and this time I entered a string less than 5 and submit the form. You can see I received the field comment is invalid, or even if I entered a string more than 10 characters, you can see the bind HTML helper is allowed me to enter the string more than 10 characters. But if I submit it, I receive the validation message here. And also, as I mentioned, I can customize this message as well. Let's back to Visual Studio. And here I use error message. And I mentioned comment should be between 5 to 10 characters. Let me save it and refresh the page. And I entered a string less than 5 characters, and you can see the customized messages appear here. The content that I want to talk about in this session was range attribute, and then we create one custom attribute and one custom validation together, and I present how you can create one custom attribute and one custom validation. Thank you for watching Golden Courses tutorial, and don't forget to subscribe our YouTube channel and follow us on the social media channel that I have. Thank you for being with us.